Good morning. So what's Facebook doing here? I'll answer that by the time we get to the end of this message. But let's start with this. This is really about, in our perspective, just an extension of a big industry open source push. And Facebook has been part of this with OCP. Facebook runs almost entirely on Linux. Almost everything we do starts with an open first philosophy. And it's been a long journey in our industry to get from where we started in open hardware, arguably I would say, in 2010, 2011 to where we are today. And we still have some distance to go to get the same kind of richness and developer capability and other things that we have in open source software. But we're well on our way, and this is a big step, and that's why I'm here. Just a little bit of a story. I think my whole career, in some sense, has been punctuated by watching open source approaches, open source software come along and kind of slowly just displace whatever else is there and make its space in our industry. And I have watched this in spite of what looks like just chaos and all kinds of other things that come with an open source movement. I have watched beautiful pieces of technology with phenomenal engineering teams kind of just slowly adapt, or in some cases, if they fought it, which is not the case here, get pushed aside by this mob of crazy engineers and revolutionaries and so forth. And, you know, in the earlier part of my career, it never made sense to me why this kept happening. I've stopped trying to make sense of why it happens. It just happens. That's pretty much the story. So what I want to do with the rest of my time up here with you is talk about how that story works and share some wisdom that I've developed in the process of watching this same cycle play out in open hardware a few times over. I'm up here with Facebook, but I was part of what were the early days of and the foundations of OpenPOWER with a different company a few years ago. And so I can tell you, having been on the inside there, the track record is strong, and the setting and the foundations are good for the story that I want to tell to have a very good ending. So the question is, if you look at all these stories of open source communities and how they start and how they end and all the rest of that, you're probably best to think about our situation here as a group that's interested in this as one story here that always starts with the question, why does open source happen? And to my point of view, open source tends to start from some background setting. It tends to start from an environment where we have a very rich set of resources all stacked in silos. We have siloed IP. We have siloed software. We have siloed engineering teams, and we have many of them. My silo, your silo, their silo, whoever it is. And for some period of time, that suffices to meet all the needs of anybody who's drawing on the resources in that silo, and it's probably the best way to do it. Keeps groups of people tight, keeps them working closely together, keeps the chaos down, keeps them focused. But over time, we start to have problems with those silos, and our end users and our developers and others start saying, I'm not getting enough out of this. I'm not getting what I want. I don't have enough voice. I don't have anything else. And that's when things can start to get messy. Because most of the people that are in here that are the biggest catalyst for change, they're not the whole population, but the biggest catalyst for change, they're not always known for being the sort that are really thinking things through. And if you develop in a chip, I think almost anybody would say the most important thing is that you really thought things through before you built it and the whole ecosystem. Most of those end users aren't as concerned about all of the particulars of the technology that needs to change. They're more concerned and more motivated by the fact that at some point along the line, what went into that silo, in their perspective, the value of it has become compressed. It's not that it doesn't have value. It's that it's not to them what it once was. So they're motivated by the fact that they want more out of these silos and what's in them than what they had before. And they may also feel like change is not happening fast enough or broadly enough or in the direction that they want. And in my perspective and experience, most of this is born out of the fact that we have too many groups of individuals sitting in silos with not enough differentiation between those silos. And what we do best to do is break those walls down and get most of those resources that were once stacked in a silo doing similar things working together for something bigger and better. And in our industry today, the sources of challenge for innovation are not about money. And they are not, at least not about lack of money or lack of investment. They are about fundamental problems with the way that we construct systems and the materials we use to build them and the protocols we designed them to run with and the fabrics we connect them with and so forth. And these are some of our hardest problems. So across all of these spectrums, we need more creativity, more innovation, and a broader base of adoption on some common silos than what we have today if we really want them to take off. Today we have stories in our industry you can look back on of many competing buses, of many competing firmware stacks, of many of these other things. And today what we really need is less competition between things that are the same and more fundamental improvement and innovation that moves beyond all of that. Now, if you were around when we had candy bar cell phones, you remember how much money it cost and how much time it took to build an infrastructure of I can use my phone anywhere. You remember maybe how hard that was if you were ever anywhere near telecommunications. This does not come quickly, and it was hard fought, and there was a lot of value to it. But I think most of us know, as valuable as that was, our world is way different because we moved beyond what was a candy bar phone into something else. Think about, just for a minute, what would be different in our economy, in your day-to-day life, and everything else if our innovation around mobile phones, at some point, for as awesome as they were, just stopped at that last candy bar phone. Okay, and then think about what happened when a few organizations came along and rethought what was going to go into that and decided to provide an engineering platform for co-developers, for consumers, for anybody else, so that they could really expand what was possible in that space and start solving more of their own problems. This took fundamental innovation in the system, a really good software stack, and some great community management. But you could say that, our world has changed dramatically just because of that little piece of glass and metal and silicon in your pocket sort of being revamped and shared. So maybe that's a compelling reason to say we should let more people get involved here, like Ken's announcement, like everything that we're seeing with OpenPOWER. But a lot of people ask a question, if I share this with everybody and I tell them all we're going to open governance and everything else, and I have all these dreamers, so forth out there, isn't this going to ruin what I built? I mean, there's a lot of revolutions out there that happen in the world that, get messy, they don't end well. Okay, let's not pretend that doesn't happen. Okay, let's not pretend that periodically a revolution turns into something like this. It's a legitimate question. But I also don't think that for the most part in our industry, when we hit these conditions, we have any reasonable, rational choice but to actually take that next big step and adapt, right? Because which thing generates economic value that's going to get everybody moving forward and keep this segment of our industry viable and keep all of the investment and innovation there? I think the answer is obvious, even if it seems strange and risky sometimes. And so if you're sold on that and you say, this is great, this is the outcome I want, and it all sounds nice and all the rest of that, but I'm also aware of the risk. If I'm moving along in that direction, how do I know whether or not I'm headed down the road towards something that's really good, or I'm headed down the road towards some kind of disaster or mess, and I'm going to regret this later? Okay, I think in open source software we understand that pretty well, and I think in open source hardware we're still figuring it out. So let's talk for a few minutes about what's different fundamentally between doing open source hardware as a big community and software. And there's a lot of stuff I'm not going to touch on here, but here I think is what's most important when you're working in this space. Almost never do you get to have a clean sheet when you're doing open source hardware. Almost always you're coming from some type of legacy. It's already been implemented, it's already been documented, it already has a community of engineers, it already has really popular ways of being used, and all of those things have a lot of inertia. And if you're going to reinvent something, it's hard to start in that space from scratch and get anywhere quickly or at all. So the best thing to do is to actually open up what you already have and share it with everybody. But that, that presents some difficulty. Because what everybody wants to do is take your big, beautiful vehicle and strip it down to its parts and modify little bits and pieces here and there. And in the end, what you want is an outcome. You want a vehicle that somebody can actually drive despite whatever's going on with the modifications. And letting people in to investigate it and to modify it and then to validate it and ship it and all the rest of that, it's costly, it consumes a lot of time and attention, and it's risky. So it's important in this particular case that we have all of the necessary tools, and Mike used the word plumbing. I'm going to use that again. Plumbing in order for a movement like this to thrive. And one of the hardest parts about open source hardware development today is that there is not nearly the kind of plumbing we have relative to open source software. If you worked in open source software in the middle 90s, you might remember people pushed patches to basically Usenet groups. People were storing code on what is less sophisticated than your average Reddit thread is today. And somehow you're supposed to make this all work and it's supposed to compile nicely. And today, I think it's almost impossible to imagine that kernels were born in that space. All this software that was Linux was born in that space. Because when you look at the tool set they have now, it's so powerful by comparison. I mean, it just makes everything easy to get in and develop and test and fork and make all the changes and all the rest of that. So it's primed to let everybody's creativity run amok and still get a pretty good outcome. And in open source hardware, we actually need to install more of that plumbing. And what I think is one of the most special parts about this announcement is it brings a lot of potential and a lot of initial value to that plumbing question. Ask yourself, what development tools do we have out there that are open today to work in this space? Not enough, but more with this. Think about the difference between when you're writing open source code and you've got compilers or JITs or anything else like that, about how agile that is. And you need the same thing in your EDA and your other toolkits to come along. And you probably want that with really good reference implementation so people have a place to start from to get moving faster. This I don't think we've solved yet, but it's great to just send your source in, get it compiled, and test and ship it. And we don't have anything like that in a fab today. We don't have anything like that in validation. But things like this will get us much closer sooner than on the course we were on, well, Ken, I don't know when you started this, but let's say yesterday. Or a month ago, or a year ago. And then finally, there has to be a market space that develops here that's a little bit more complicated than downloads. It's not that a lot of this probably won't work in the same sense of source code and data that is interchangeable and you can use. But in the end, shipping a chip requires shipping product. Shipping open product requires an ecosystem that can support open product, and that too takes some time to develop. But there's the right sort of fundamental basis here for all of these things to happen. And then the last part is licensing. I don't think our industry has fully cracked open source hardware licensing yet, and patent protection and everything else. But again, I think today this is a huge step in the right direction for our whole industry. If you were around when Linux was first getting hot and people had a lot of questions about it, the biggest concern was, is this legally viable? Am I going to get myself in trouble if I adopt and use this? Am I going to get sued? But some things happen in that space. And part of what had them ending well were some really big organizations with really rich patent portfolios deciding to step in and back that movement and make sure it was safe for everybody else that wanted to innovate and take some risk there. So this group is to be commended for helping us move along in that direction. I think there's more work to do. So in summary, you want a vehicle to move this forward and move it quickly. You need all of these things in the truck. And I think basically what's been announced here is a really big step forward and something very substantive for all of these things in the truck. So I want to switch gears and talk about one more thing. I'm going to play a video for you for a moment. I think this is a great metaphor for how open source movements come along when you start from something that had a proprietary legacy and is moving out into the open. I just want to I want you to pay attention to how you feel while you watch this. Okay. Basically, we have lots of things out there in the world that go through fundamental change from one thing into something else entirely. We watch this happen in nature. It's not a surprise. But sometimes when it's happening right in front of us, in the moment it's happening, there are a few moments that look a little grotesque. It's a little uncomfortable. It's a little like, ugh. You know, I understand how this happens in the end, but I'm watching this go on. I'm in the middle of it. I'm not quite sure it's headed the right way. There's a little uncertainty, right? I mean, that butterfly could be dead just now, or it just pops out and you have something new and beautiful there. And what I'd like you to take away is we've had this happen often enough in open source that this is probably the most likely outcome here. But it's not going to take away the mystery and kind of the weird moments for anybody that's along for this ride. You don't get to get away from that. That's actually part of what makes it exciting. If it were a certainty, most of us wouldn't be here. It would be boring. You wouldn't be working on it. So this magnitudinal shift we're talking about here is about getting onto that new platform and kind of reinventing something that we already think we know into something else entirely that solves all kinds of new problems. It also needs to end in kind of a boring way. Okay? We need to get as quickly as possible in this space from all this excitement and all this possibility to I can buy this anywhere I want it, I can use it any way I want it, I can talk about it like it's every day and it's routine. There's a lot of commerce and interaction around it. That should be the end goal, right? That should govern a lot of how we think together working in these communities. Yes, we want the most exceptional engineering and the most fascinating stuff, but is this going to get us to a good market? Is this going to get us to, this is just normal? Is it going to get us to boring, but super useful and reliable in some sense in that different world? So I think those are the governing principles. Just some parting advice here based on what I've experienced working in other open source communities. The first thing is, it's forming a new thing here, but it's really easy for this to turn into another silo. There are open source movements that compete with each other. There are open source movements that look at other movements that aren't as open or are closed and say, I don't want anything to do with you, right? And we end up with new silos. And that happens for some good reasons, but it's really way, way better if we all put some energy into making sure that we're doing our best to keep everybody out of the silo, even if you got to pull on them a little bit. Even if as a group we need to exert some pressure on each other, stay out of the silos. Make sure that what we're doing here will integrate with a larger developer community, because the power of open source is in just, for practical purposes, an infinite resource pool of engineers that is happy to be in your space. They're happy to wander wherever they want to go. They don't feel restricted. At Facebook, we have this expression that's been used for years. This journey is 1% finished. And it doesn't matter how many years you've been at Facebook or what you've accomplished or how far you've come. You always seem to end with this message of journey 1% finished. So if you're building a new data platform and you've been doing it for years, and you're making all of these massive improvements, and you're sharing it, and you're growing this huge community, you keep coming back every year and saying, 1% finished. For a little while, it confused me. Why do we keep saying that? Why don't we say 5% finished? 20, 50. And I think basically the metaphor is this. You got to remember that for most of these things, even with all the progress you've already made, there's still a big, open, very interesting future in front of us with a lot of potential. And it's easy to start thinking about getting to the end as if when I get there, I'll just be done. And that kind of causes us to undercut the total potential we can unlock. Okay, so I got into this industry in my career just as we were stopping a lot of really fundamental innovation in computer systems and computer architecture, and really focusing on just incremental version improvement. Don't change things too much. Make sure the system is stable, the architecture is stable, the design principles are stable. And this ran from the core of the systems through our firmware, our compilers, the software we wrote, everything else. I came into the industry around the birth of Java. Nobody wanted to pay attention to the hardware anymore. They just wanted software productivity. Now, I think it's pretty cool to look further back from that when we had all of these strange systems in our industry, some of which were alien, and see all of this fundamental innovation going on, because I could see where the world had come from to get us where we are today. And I kind of like to imagine we get in a time machine and move forward a few years from now. And if you're a part of this and you're working hard on it, this gives you a chance to be one of those individuals to say, I was part of something that presented one of those magnitudinal shifts in our industry. It was once this way, and then a whole bunch of us got together and did something that seemed a little crazy, and we made it into something else entirely. And that's part of the legacy of what you get to say you contributed and you were a part of for somebody else to take from there. So for me, this is probably some significant step of ushering in this new era in our industry. And it's not a really big crowd. It never is. These stories they tell, there's never millions of people. It's usually a relatively small room. It's usually a fairly well-convicted set of people and some open questions. And then you work on it and something else entirely new comes out of it. So I'm really excited to be a part of this today, to share in this announcement, and I see really good things coming forward. And I think over the next few presentations, you're going to see some awesome stuff that shows this is already well underway even beyond what you've seen so far. Thank you.